Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, sahaviryan karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome to you all, and Happy New Year to you. Nice way to begin the new year with our new study of the Bhagavad Gita. Not exactly new. Of course, many of you have studied the Bhagavad Gita, and it's been our convention here at our Arsha Bodha Center Ashram. It's been a convention for us every Saturday morning to study Bhagavad Gita. We've had a class in the 20 years we've been here at this ashram. We have studied the Bhagavad Gita 3 times all the way through. Each time took about 5 years. We may also spend the next 5 years studying the Bhagavad Gita the 4th time. But don't let that 5 years scare you. It is the most wonderful journey, a process that we'll be engaged in together. And of course, as we go from chapter to chapter, the subject matter changes significantly, and you'll be seeing something new all the time. Besides the fact that the Bhagavad Gita is just such an extraordinary text, I think the fact that I'm so enthusiastic about teaching it here for a 4th time, that shows something unusual about this text. I don't feel like, oh, I have to teach the Bhagavad Gita again. It's the opposite. I am just so thrilled, really, to be returning to the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm delighted to have so many of you be able to attend this class virtually by watching these webcasts. When we have classes in our lecture hall, pre-pandemic, we would have, for Bhagavad Gita class, between 100 and 200 students would come for Saturday morning Bhagavad Gita. But right now, there are many more of you watching this webcast live, and in the coming weeks, it's likely that there will be many thousands of people who will have the opportunity to watch these videos, this webcast. And as a teacher, that I find that so rewarding to know that these teachings are reaching and helping so many people. So I'm delighted to share this with you, and happy that we could begin this new year with our new study of the Bhagavad Gita. You see on the screen the first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, and there's a convention to begin each class with recitation of the verses. Generally, what we've done is we'll recite the 10 verses prior to where we're studying. Of course, we're starting the class today, so we're going to recite the first 10 verses. That serves 2 purposes. One is it's prayer. It's a convention to begin any class with the various kinds of prayer. So this recitation will be prayerful. Secondly, it helps get the verses in our minds, in our ears, so to speak, a little bit through that process of recitation. And when we recite these verses again and again, it becomes very beautiful and very meaningful. So we will do that today. We'll start with recitation of just the first 10 verses. And I'll talk more about the meter of the verses. Most of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita are in a very simple, short meter, having 8 syllables and a quarter. You can just listen and repeat, and you'll get the correct sense of the verses. So, and I've composed these slides in such a way that while I'm reciting the Sanskrit, you can glance at the translation. I think this is very important. To recite Sanskrit verses without knowing the meaning, I think is empty. We're missing out on something. I've had the blessing of having studied Sanskrit for such a long time that as I'm chanting the verses in Sanskrit, the meaning is absolutely clear. Many of you haven't had that opportunity to study Sanskrit thoroughly. So that you too can have the meaning in your mind as you're chanting, here's what you do. As I chant the Sanskrit, you glance down at the meaning. When I'm done chanting the Sanskrit, you will repeat the Sanskrit, knowing the meaning. That's very, very simple, very important. Okay, we'll begin. This is chapter 1, verse 1. Repeat after me, please. Dhritarashruvacha, Dhritarashruvacha, Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre, Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre, Samaveta Yuyutsavaha, Samaveta Yuyutsavaha, Mamakah Pandavaschaiva, Mamakah Pandavaschaiva, Kimakurvata Sanjaya, Kimakurvata Sanjaya, Sanjayo Vacha, Sanjayo Vacha, Drishtva tu Pandavanikam, Drishtva tu Pandavanikam, Vyudham Duryodhanastada, Vyudham Duryodhanastada, Acharyamupasamgamya, Acharyamupasamgamya, Raja Vachanam Abravita, Raja Vachanam Abravita, Pashyaitam Panduputranam, Pashyaitam Panduputranam, Acharya Mahatim Chamum, Acharya Mahatim Chamum, Vyudham Drupadaputrena, Vyudham Drupadaputrena, Tava Shishyena Dhimata, Tava Shishyena Dhimata, Atra Shura Maheshwasa, Atra Shura Maheshwasa, Bhimarjuna Samayudhi, Bhimarjuna Samayudhi, Yuyudhano Viratascha, Yuyudhano Viratascha, Drupadascha Maharataha, Drupadascha Maharataha, Drishtaketushchekitanaha, Drishtaketushchekitanaha, Kashirajascha Viryavan, Kashirajascha Viryavan, Purujat Kunti Bhojascha, Purujat Kunti Bhojascha, Shaibhyascha Narapungavaha, Shaibhyascha Narapungavaha, Yuddhamanyuscha Vikranta, Yuddhamanyuscha Vikranta, Uttamaujascha Viryavan, Uttamaujascha Viryavan, Saubhadro Draupadeyascha, Saubhadro Draupadeyascha, Sarvaheva Maharathaha, Sarvaheva Maharathaha, Asmakam tu Vishishtaye, Asmakam tu Vishishtaye, Tani Bodhadvajottama, Tani Bodhadvajottama, Nayaka Mama Sainyasya, Nayaka Mama Sainyasya, Sanyartham Tan Bravimite, Sanyartham Tan Bravimite, Bhavan Bhishmascha Karnascha, Bhavan Bhishmascha Karnascha, Kripascha Samitinjayaha, Kripascha Samitinjayaha, Ashwat Ashwattama vikarnascha, Ashwattama vikarnascha, Saumadattistataiva cha, Saumadattistataiva cha, Anye cha bahava shura, Anye cha bahava shura, Mararte tyakta jivitaha, Mararte tyakta jivitaha, Nana shastra praharanaha, Nana shastra praharanaha, Sarve yuddha visharadaha, Sarve yuddha visharadaha, Aparyaptam tadasmakam, Aparyaptam tadasmakam, Balam bhishma birakshitam, Balam bhishma birakshitam, Paryaptam tvaramete Paryaptam tvaramete Balam bhima birakshitam, Balam bhima birakshitam. Very nice. The very act of chanting these verses is delightful. If you're chanting it for the first time, it may take you a while to get used to it, but once you've chanted these verses for a while, it just becomes just a wonderful sadhana, a wonderful spiritual practice. Of course, we're going to be going through each of these verses and seeing their meaning, and not just the word-by-word meaning, but the application of these verses to our own individual processes of spiritual growth. After all, that's why do we study a text like the Bhagavad Gita? These texts are like guidebooks to lead us forward on our own journeys of spiritual growth. We'll have much more to say about that in coming classes as we go through the Bhagavad Gita. We should perhaps begin by considering for a few moments why is it that the Bhagavad Gita, without doubt, is the most widely studied scripture in the Hindu tradition? Let's consider that for a moment. A quick comment. Many people say that the Bhagavad Gita is the Bible of Hinduism. That statement is actually incorrect, and let me explain why. The Bible is the foundation scripture, the base scripture, root scripture on which the Christian tradition is based. The Bhagavad Gita is not the foundational scripture or root scripture on which the Hindu tradition is based. The main scripture for the Hindu tradition is the Veda. The 4 Vedas are composed collectively the main scripture for the Vedas. So for this technical reason, let us not erroneously say that the Bhagavad Gita is like the Bible. It is, however, by far the most widely studied scripture, and that's what we should definitely discuss here briefly. There are so many ways to explain it. Here's one way that I find very significant. I'm not a great lover of poetry. Most poetry is very, for me, very obscure and goes right over my head. But the Bhagavad Gita is poetry, and I love every word of it. And one reason I love it is that it's not only poetic, it's also very clear and easy to understand. Usually, clarity and poetry don't seem to go together. If something is very clear, it's like a manual, and it's not very poetic. If something is very poetic, it's often not very clear. So in the Bhagavad Gita, we have this amazing, I find it, an amazing combination of deeply poetic, beautiful expressions, which are simultaneously crystal clear in the spiritual wisdom that they convey. We can find plenty of dull, boring books, which are not very poetic, but do convey lofty spiritual truths, we can find plenty of lofty spiritual poetry, which is so hard to understand. So this is the point I'm trying to make, is that one of several reasons that the Bhagavad Gita is the most widely studied Hindu scripture is this rare combination of beautiful, profound poetry and crystal clear clarity in its communication of these profound spiritual truths. That's not the only reason the Bhagavad Gita is the most widely studied scripture. This is a very important point. And the second reason I would say is the Bhagavad Gita conveys the main spiritual teachings of the ancient rishis in a context that we can relate to. Let me explain that. The ancient rishis are the ones from whom we received the Vedas. The Vedas are the poetic outpourings of those ancient rishis, and a portion of those Vedas is a section called Upanishad. You should know this term. Upanishad is one of several sections in the Vedas. And Upanishads are significant because they contain the purely spiritual teachings of the ancient rishis. The Vedas contain lots of prayers, lots of rituals, lots of obscure meditations, but the Vedas also include these wonderful spiritual teachings. Those spiritual teachings are compiled in sections called Upanishads, and you may already know this. The Upanishads are compiled at the end of each of the four Vedas. At the end of the Rig Veda, there are Upanishads. At the end of the Sama, Yajur, Tarva Veda, at the end of each of the four Vedas, there are Upanishads compiled at the end. Because they're compiled at the end of the Vedas, in Sanskrit, end is anta. Veda anta, Vedanta. So the word Vedanta is a synonym for Upanishad, referring to the spiritual wisdom found in the Vedas, in the final section called Upanishad. Now, that being said, the contents of those Upanishads are not very accessible. Many of you have studied, I've taught the Upanishads many, many times, and while the teachings of the Upanishads are incredibly profound, they're not easy to grasp. And the reason is the context. So the ancient rishis were spiritual geniuses, spiritual giants, and they lived lives completely removed from worldly activities. They lived in huts up in the mountains and along the banks of sacred rivers, and they lived deeply contemplative lives, lives that are not very similar to the life that you and I might lead. So they lived these in a rarefied spiritual world, if I can use that kind of description. And their lives then were very different from ours, and as a result, the way in which they expressed themselves was very different than the way we would express ourselves. Their lives were so narrowly focused on this spiritual wisdom that led to an approach in the composition of the Upanishads, which is extremely profound, but profound meaning deep, and sometimes so deep that it's hard to grasp. Not sometimes, frequently hard to grasp. The context of the Bhagavad Gita could not be more different. First of all, the very same teachings found in the Upanishads are taught by Sri Krishna to Arjuna. So it's the same Vedantic teachings that originated with the ancient rishis in the Upanishads. It is those very teachings that are being imparted by Sri Krishna to Arjuna, and that, of course, is the core story, as it were, of the Bhagavad Gita. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. But what's different is the context. So the context of the Upanishads is this rarefied spiritual world of the rishis. The context of the Bhagavad Gita, as most of you know, the physical context is a battlefield. You know the story. Most of you know the story well. The battle is about to begin. Arjuna asks, and we'll see these verses shortly. Arjuna asks Sri Krishna to drive the chariot out onto the battlefield so that Arjuna can inspect the both sides of the both armies before the battle begins. And while they're out there in the middle of the battlefield, a dialogue ensues. Sri Krishna and Arjuna are engaged in a long dialogue, goes on for a total of 18 chapters. Those 18 chapters of dialogue is the Bhagavad Gita. The physical context is a battlefield. Now, consider the implications of the context. The rishis, the context of the Upanishads, as taught by the rishis, their context was this highly rarefied spiritual life, as I said before, which is something that we may not relate to well. But battlefield is surprisingly relatable. Let me explain why. There are so many aspects of life that resemble a battlefield. Those of you who have to commute to work, you know that sometimes the highways and roads are like battlefields as everyone is trying to get to their destination. If you go to work, and sometimes employees are vying with each other for advancement, so a workplace can resemble a battlefield. Sadly, sometimes you come home and your own home can sometimes resemble a battlefield. The idea is there are many areas of conflict and challenge and difficulty in life, and those challenges and difficulties and conflicts make many aspects of our lives resemble a battlefield. Thank goodness we're not soldiers on a battlefield. That would be a very different thing altogether. But there are aspects of our lives that resemble a battlefield. So for that reason, and here's the point. The point is, in the Bhagavad Gita, the same spiritual teachings that were imparted by the ancient rishis in such a lofty, rarefied manner, those very same teachings are presented in the Bhagavad Gita in a very down-to-earth manner in the context of the battle of life. There's so much symbolism involved, and we're going to be seeing some of that symbolism shortly, including the symbolism of the battlefield. So, in fact, before we can talk about the symbolism of the battlefield, let's be sure that we understand the historical battlefield. The historical battlefield is called Kurukshetra, is a name of a place. You can visit it even today in North India. Kurukshetra is the kshetra, the land of the Kurus. Kuru was the name of the family, the dynasty, the lineage. And so Kurukshetra was the land or area or place where this horrendous battle took place. And that horrendous battle, of course, is the central story of the great Mahabharata. So we need to first set the Gita in its context in the Mahabharata, and then we'll come back to the context of the battlefield. The Mahabharata, as most of you know, is this incredible, epic poetry from ancient times about a conflict between two portions of a family. Obviously, I'm not going to tell the story of the Mahabharata here. It would be very inappropriate. But that huge epic, it goes on for 84,000 verses, the longest poem in the world. 84,000 verses broken up into 18 books called parvas. So if we go to the 12th of those 18 books or parvas, we find a small section among those 84,000 verses. There's a small section of 700 verses. 700 verses over a span of 18 chapters. I think there are some 2,000 chapters in the whole of the Mahabharata. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to double check that number. That may be incorrect. Don't hold on to it. But the of the 84,000, I think that's correct. Anyway, we can check on that. Of the 84,000 verses in the Mahabharata, we come in the 12th book to the 700 verse sliver. If you think about it, 700 verses amongst 84,000 is this tiny little bit. But that 700 verse segment is excerpted from the Mahabharata and studied independently. In fact, there are several sections of the Mahabharata which are excerpted and studied independently. In general, the word Gita can mean, of course, Gita has several meanings. Some of you are thinking you know a girl whose name is Gita, but that's not the Gita we're talking about. Some of you know that in Sanskrit, Gita means song, like Geet in Hindi, Gita, song. And in this context, Gita can be a name for a section of spiritual teachings excerpted from the Mahabharata. There are several Gitas excerpted from the Mahabharata. Some of you know there's a section called Anu Gita. There's a Bhagavad Gita, there's an Anu Gita, there are several others. So Gita can be understood as a small section of spiritual teachings excerpted from the Bhagavad Gita. And this particular one is called Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad means belonging to Bhagavan, God. So Bhagavad Gita is the spiritual teachings excerpted from the Bhagavad Gita, excerpted from the Mahabharata, which were imparted by Bhagavan in the form of Sri Krishna. Also, there's a more common translation. So Bhagavad Gita, the song of God. Nice, and it's not incorrect either. But just to give you a little bit more depth of understanding, Gita can mean song. So Bhagavad Gita can mean the song of God. But really speaking, Gita here is a name used for an excerpt from the Mahabharata. Okay, enough said. So in the midst of that 84,000 verse, and it's the whole Mahabharata is just a wonderful, wonderful teaching. So many profound sections. Let me interrupt myself not to start teaching Mahabharata, because how long would it take me to even give an overview of that 84,000 verse text? Absolutely not possible and not appropriate here in this context. So let's stay focused on the Bhagavad Gita, which this tiny 700 verse sliver is like a gem in that vast ocean of teachings. If the 84,000 verses form an ocean of spiritual teachings, the 700 verses of the Bhagavad Gita is absolutely like a gem found in that great ocean. Okay, that is the context of the Bhagavad Gita in the Mahabharata. Now we'd like to return to the context of the battlefield. And a good way to do that would actually be to return to the very first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, which introduces the battlefield. So we will begin now with the first verse of the Bhagavad Gita. Again, it's important to, it's traditional and helpful to have the teacher recite the verse and have the students recite after. So let us continue with that, and we'll do so to introduce each new verse as we proceed. So repeat after me. Dhritarashtra Vacha Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yuyutsavaha Mamaka Pandavaschaiva Kimakurvata Sanjaya. Very good. So it begins by, and this is the style of, not just the style of the Mahabharata, style of most not most scriptures, but of the epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, like the Bhagavata Purana, they all have this style. And the style has it that the one who is speaking is introduced in this manner. Dhritarashtra Uvacha. Uvacha, he said. Who said? Who is speaking? Dhritarashtra, most of you know as the blind king, the father of Duryodhana. Duryodhana is the so-called bad guy of the epic. And Dhritarashtra is his father, who is blind. And again, at least at this point, we'll try to minimize the details of the Mahabharata, but some details we'll need to get into here. Let's see the verse. So Dhritarashtra said, and Dhritarashtra here is speaking, if you look at the fourth line, he is speaking to Sanjaya. Sanjaya is his assistant. Really speaking, Sanjaya is his charioteer, but if you're a blind king, you probably don't spend a lot of time in a chariot. Usually the charioteer is the one to take you out onto the battlefield. A blind king has no place on the battlefield, so therefore the blind king, Dhritarashtra, is back in his palace along with Sanjaya, his charioteer. And Dhritarashtra asks Sanjaya in the fourth line, Kim akurvata, what did they do? What did they do? All the warriors, and all the warriors in the, actually let's take it in reverse order. In the third line, who were the warriors gathered on the battlefield? Some of them were mamakaha, my warriors, which means the Dhritarashtra had 100 sons. So those 100 sons, excuse me, are out there on the battlefield. Also, prior to the battle, many alliances had been formed. So other kings and warriors are out there fighting on the side of the Kauravas. So this is a little tricky. Both sides of the family belong to the lineage of King Kuru. King Kuru lived many generations before. So technically, both sides of the family are Kaurava. Kaurava means belonging to the lineage of Kuru. But there's a convention that the sons of Dhritarashtra are called Kaurava, and the sons of Pandu, you might remember, was a brother of Dhritarashtra, the other side of the family. the two sides of the family that fought with each other so much. So the sons of Pandu are called Pandava. Pandava, the sons of Pandu, and Kaurava, the sons and those allied with King Dhritarashtra. So in the third line, Mamakaha, the warriors which are my warriors, the Kauravas, Pandavaha cha eva. In Sanskrit, words get run together frequently. So Pandavaha cha eva get combined due to rules of called sandhi. Due to those grammar rules, it becomes Pandavash chaiva. So the Pandavas and my own warriors and the Pandavas, what about them? They are backing up one line. Second line, they are yuyutsavaha. They're ready to fight. They're eager to fight. They're warriors. Yuyutsavaha in singular, Yuyutsava is plural. Yuyutsu is a warrior, someone who's ready to fight. So all those warriors are samaveta. Breaking the words apart. Samavetaha. They have gathered together. And now finally we come to the significant part. Where have they gathered? Kurukshetre, in the first line. They've gathered together on the Kurukshetra, as I said before, that's the name of the battlefield. So they've gathered together on the battlefield, the Kauravas on one side of the battle, the Pandavas on the other side of the battlefield. They've gathered together, they're facing each other, and in this position, in the 12th book of the Mahabharata, this is the first day of an 18-day war. So the great Mahabharata war is about to take place. At this point in the 12th book of the Mahabharata, at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, is the morning of the 18 days of bloody warfare that are going to be fought, which forms a central part of the Mahabharata. Now, that being said, here comes the symbolism in the very first word of the Bhagavad Gita. What is the first word? Dharma. What? Not an accidental choice of first word. Dharma, righteousness. So the Kurukshetra, the battlefield, is called here Dharma Kshetra. Those A endings, Dharma Kshetra, means on the battlefield. Gives a sense of location. So here, the battlefield, Kurukshetra, is being called Dharma Kshetra, the field of Dharma. How significant. The field of Dharma is where the forces of Dharma and Adharma face off. The battle between Dharma and Adharma, or in Western literature, you'll always see the prototypical battle between good and evil. The term evil is not exactly the same as adharma. We'll talk about that perhaps later. But just as in Western literature, we have this prototypical battle between good and evil. Here, in the Mahabharata in general, and in the Bhagavad Gita in particular, we begin with this prototypical battle between dharma, righteousness, and adharma, the opposite of righteousness, unrighteousness. And this symbolically then represents our lives, because each and every day in life, you are faced with choices. What is a choice? You can take the path of dharma, you can take the path of adharma. Sometimes the path of adharma is very attractive, it's very convenient. It might even be financially lucrative to take that path of adharma. And the choice is up to you. And that choice, a choice that is made not just once, but many times each day you're confronted with these choices. So that conflict that we face every day in life, the conflict between needing to choose the right path, needing to avoid the wrong path, already that's being represented in the very first word of the Bhagavad Gita. Some further symbolism. Dhritarashtra, the king, is blind. That blindness, his blindness, is representative of ignorance. It symbolically represents ignorance. You know, I'm pausing because I'm trying to avoid getting too much into the story of the Mahabharata, but you know that all the problems were caused not by Dhritarashtra himself, but by his son Duryodhana. Duryodhana hated his cousins. The cousins were the Pandavas. Duryodhana, from childhood onwards, hated the Pandavas and was jealous of them and tried to kill them many times. This is a whole complex story of the Mahabharata. Here's the symbolism. The acts of adharma. Duryodhana, even as a child, tried to kill his cousins. You might have had some disagreements with your cousins and other family members, but you wouldn't dream of killing them. Duryodhana tried hard several times to kill his cousins. That's how adharmic he was. So adharma is performed by Duryodhana. Duryodhana is the agent of adharma. But the symbolism here is that Duryodhana is the son of Dhritarashtra. Look, profound symbolism. Duryodhana, the agent of adharma, is the son of Dhritarashtra, the blind king who represents ignorance. And I'll make it very clear. Adharma is born of ignorance. I'll say that again. Adharma is born of ignorance. And let me explain. This is a very important Vedantic teaching. Ignorance, there are many kinds of ignorance, but here we're talking about, our subject matter is a profoundly spiritual subject matter. So the specific kind of ignorance we're referring to then is ignorance of your true divine nature. As you understand well in the Hindu tradition, everything is a manifestation of God, of Ishvara. A very famous statement in an Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, says, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Says, all this is Brahman. All this is God, loosely speaking, meaning, implying the fact that everything is a manifestation of God. Everything is a manifestation of divinity. Everything is divine. This is the vision of the ancient rishis. Everything is divine, meaning you, me, everyone else in this world, and the world itself, everything is a manifestation of divinity. Everything is divine. Now we have the problem. How can divine beings do such horrible deeds? I was reading a book about World War II. And most of you know, in World War II, there was a profoundly adharmic person named Hitler whose actions led to the death of tens of millions of people. Tens of millions of people. He killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And on the battlefield, his deeds, his direction, led to the death of tens of millions of people. Those numbers are staggering. How do we even grasp those numbers? Here's the point. Adolf Hitler was engaged in these terrible acts of adharma, but from a Hindu perspective, Adolf Hitler was as divine as you and me. My God, how can we understand that? How can we say that Adolf Hitler was a divine being and Duryodhana was a divine being? The divine being named Duryodhana tried to kill his cousins. The divine being named Hitler killed tens of millions of people. How can we understand that? Go back to my leading statement. Adharma is born of ignorance. We'll use a Sanskrit word for ignorance, avidya. Vidya means knowledge, avidya, ignorance. So from avidya comes adharma, unrighteousness. And here's how. This may sound strange. Try this. Suppose Adolf Hitler, prior to World War II, suppose he got enlightened. Don't ask me how. And I know it's just a silly fantasy, but suppose Adolf Hitler came to understand that his nature is divine, that the nature of everyone else is divine. Suppose he understood that all those Jews were divine people. If Adolf Hitler recognized the innate divinity of everyone and everything, would that enlightened Adolf Hitler, in our fantasy, would that enlightened Adolf Hitler have engaged in all those terrible deeds? Never! The point we're making is that due to ignorance of that fundamental divinity of all that exists, it's a spiritual ignorance. It's not an ordinary ignorance, a spiritual ignorance. Due to that avidya, that spiritual ignorance, due to the non-recognition of the innate divinity of everything that exists, due to that particular ignorance, adharma is born. You see the connection now. Had Hitler been an enlightened saint, he could not have acted in such adharmic ways. And no wise person, no enlightened person can act in such adharmic ways. But to the extent that ignorance covers, and this is Dhritarashtra, being blind. Ignorance has often been called like a veil. In fact, that term is used so much, the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance obscures our vision and prevents us from seeing the innate divinity of all that exists. When that veil of ignorance prevents us from seeing that innate divinity, we're then capable of all kinds of acts of adharma, because why not? Conversely, when the veil of ignorance is removed with the help of these spiritual teachings, when you recognize the innate divinity of all that exists, it becomes impossible. How can you hurt a divine being? How can you, it's like someone you love dearly, you're not going to injure or do anything harmful to. This is a fundamental teaching, and let me make one more connection, and that is, I said before that in the West, we see this prototypical battle between good and evil. And I said at that time that evil is not the same as adharma. And this is worth observing here. In the Hindu tradition, there is no equivalent to the Western concept of evil. Some of you know that in Western religions, the force of evil is personified as the devil, as Satan, shaitan. It's a real being. Evil is a thing. Evil exists, and therefore you have to watch out. The Hindu tradition looks upon it so differently. There is no equivalent concept to evil in the Hindu tradition. There's no force of evil. There's no power of evil. There's no entity or deity that is the embodiment of evil. There's no such thing as evil. However, there's plenty of adharma. Adharma are acts that violate principles of dharma, acts that cause injury, in a very broad way of speaking. There's lots of adharma. So we can't speak of evil in the Hindu tradition. We can absolutely recognize the terrible consequences of acts of adharma. And adharma, as I just said, is an action, is a deed. And it is an action or deed born of what? You got it. Born of ignorance, avidya. Avidya, ignorance, is that veil of ignorance which prevents you from seeing the innate divinity of all that exists. That veil of ignorance represented by Dhritarashtra's blindness leads to acts of adharma. So from the blind king, Dhritarashtra, came the terribly adharmic son, Duryodhana, symbolizing from the veil of ignorance, avidya, comes all the acts of adharma that cause so much harm in the world. Swami Vivekananda, the very famous Swami from 150 years ago, was famous for this particular statement. He said, "There is no evil apart from ignorance." He said it in various ways, but he said, "There is no evil except for ignorance." And he was referring not to ignorance in general, but this specific kind of ignorance, this ignorance which is like a veil which prevents us from seeing the innate divinity of all that exists. So look at this. The Bhagavad Gita opens with the blind king speaking as the representative of ignorance, which led to all the adharma. The story of the Mahabharata is just filled with all the acts of adharma committed by Duryodhana and others, and the terrible consequences of all of that. Just to wrap this up, and I think, where is the time? Yeah, we'll wrap up this class shortly. We'll try to keep these classes to 1 hour in length. Sorry. Some people argue that spiritual practice, like the study of the Bhagavad Gita, has no direct benefit in addressing the problems of the world. So today, the world is suffering from so many terrible problems. And I'm talking not natural problems, like we're in the midst of the pandemic now, so we're not talking about natural problems like the virus, but man-made problems like war. Wars continue in various parts of the world. Sadly, they go on and on and on. So look at this. War is definitely an act of adharma, an act of adharma born of ignorance, of vidya. Here we are engaging ourselves in a spiritual practice. To study the Bhagavad Gita is a spiritual practice, sadhana. And the ultimate goal of that practice, that sadhana, is to remove that veil of ignorance. By removing that veil of ignorance, you will see so vividly the innate divinity of all that exists. And when you see that innate divinity, you respect that divinity. You love that divinity, and that wisdom, that recognition, prevents you from acts of adharma. It is impossible to willfully or deliberately inflict harm on that which you perceive vividly as being divine. Just as you won't hurt yourself deliberately, you won't hurt that which is divine deliberately. The point here, and the final point for this class, is that this spiritual wisdom that we will discover through our study of the Bhagavad Gita can remove that veil of ignorance, leading you to vividly recognize the innate divinity of all that exists, including your own self. And in the absence of that ignorance, adharma comes to an end. There's much more to be explained about how adharma is the result of ignorance. Well, it goes through the whole of the Bhagavad Gita. This is a major topic, so we'll leave it here, and we'll come back to that topic many times in our future study. So before we conclude this class, there's several announcements, important announcements. This class will continue every Saturday morning in the United States. And if you miss a class, all these classes are then recorded and kept on YouTube and available to you, either by going to my YouTube channel or by going to our website. You can find all of that. The slides that you see, these slides are available on our website. Audio recordings of these classes and podcasts of these classes, it's all available on our website. So make use of those resources. I'm supposed to remind you that if you're a regular student watching these videos every week, you are expected to make a regular donation. The amount of the donation is whatever you think is appropriate, but the idea is if you're studying regularly, there should be some kind of regular ongoing donation. And you can do that in varieties of ways. We have a Raksha Dana program where you become a supporter of the ashram. You can also, if you work for a large corporation, many companies have matching gift programs, so you can work with them and get some additional funds sent to support our ashram. Of course, we don't charge fees for anything we do here, so this ashram functions 100% with your generous donations. On our website, there's a page on donations. You'll find a lot of information there. You can go to that page and get any information you need. And just to conclude, as I said at the beginning, this is just a delightful way to begin a new year with a new text to study. Should also mention that we're starting several new texts or studies at the beginning of this year. Bhagavad Gita will be taught every Saturday morning. We have a new Vedanta class on Tuesday evenings, a class called Advaita Makaranda. Nectar of Non-Duality is a text for our Tuesday evening class, which will also be webcast like this class. Also, tomorrow, Sunday, we're going to begin a new program called A Course in Meditation. That Course in Meditation is a series of 42 lessons which will take you through every aspect of building a practice of meditation. And each week, a new lesson will be uploaded every Sunday morning. So beginning tomorrow morning, we will upload the first of those 42 lessons. So plenty, much, and just nice that we can make use of these modern tools, the internet and so forth, to make these teachings so widely available. Again, it's delightful for me to spend this time with you, and please join us for our next class. We'll conclude with a prayer. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.